Welcome, let's do my intro. Welcome to lesson 7 in Automate Yourself with Google Apps Script. We're making this the final lesson. And yeah, let me just start the slide sharing. So today, first of all, some background. My son stole my spare monitor so he can game on it. So I've got to do it all on one laptop. So we'll see how that goes. Let's share this screen. Okay, so can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Cool. So this lesson is called Apro Time. What we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to see server-side and server-side and client-side JavaScript working together. So we're going to develop a complete app for planning Apros. And I can give you, right away, I can give you a demo of this app. So it looks like this. It's a web page that is sitting on top of this spreadsheet. So what would happen is on this page, you have a simple web page that you could send in a link to colleagues with a simple design, an important quote. I'll just let you read that quote. Does anyone not know who Humphrey Bogart is, by the way?
Yes, me.
Oh, here, yeah, this is a thing that, you know, it's like all these millennials and stuff. Now, Humphrey Bogart was an actor. Casablanca is the famous movie with Humphrey Bogart. So it's like, I think he had the peak of his career in the 40s and 50s after the Second World War. There's some great movies. And he was like the tough guy of the time, bit of kind of a gangsterish look. Anyway. All right, so we've got this thing. It's a page for, you know, for the real problem that a lot of people have working at TX Group is Apro planning. We need to solve this problem. So this would be a page where you could provide all the details of some event like an Apro, and you can show people dynamically who's coming based on what's in the spreadsheet. And then at the bottom, you've got the RSVP, yeah, and that's basically it. Now, what I've done here, I was going to go and use the CSS framework called material.css, but instead, I found something that is even easier to use, which I think is going to be better for anyone who's getting into HTML and CSS. And what's nice about this is called mvp.css. I need to put that in the links. But what's super nice about this CSS framework is it allows you to style a web page without using without really needing to use CSS. You basically, as I'll show you in a bit, you basically just add this to your application and it automatically just makes it look nicer. All right, so first we need to jump back though to a little bit of theory. So you might remember this slide from the first lesson we did. So, you know, where does Google Apps Script execute? Now the point here is that you have, in this case, server-side JavaScript, which runs on Google's cloud. And then you have client-side JavaScript, which runs in the web browser. And to develop a web application, you often need to use both. And that may, we'll look at the code in a minute, but that may be a little bit confusing to start with, but just to be aware, JavaScript can run in your web browser, but also it's running on Google's servers. And for this application to work, what we're going to do is link those two together. All right, so let me explain a little bit around the application. So we've got the super simple spreadsheet for collecting the details of people who are coming to the apero, name, email, are they coming, and any dietary needs, basically. And that corresponds to what's in this form here at the bottom. Okay. And then within this, or in the usual place, you go to Tools, Script Editor. I've been putting together the application. This is all the code, but there's also now some HTML, some CSS, and some JavaScript. Okay. Now, let me just say a few things about this first, and then what I'll do is I'll explain the code at the end. But first I want to just introduce a few concepts here. Now, HTML, maybe you've, or let me just do a quick test. Or how would you rate your HTML skills? Just put it on the chat, where 10 is fantastic, you're an HTML guru, and 1 is, what is HTML? You don't even know.
6.
Okay. 3, okay. 5. And 8.298392. Very okay. Okay. Well, what's nice about this, so first of all, if you go to this, let me just give you a quick introduction to this Mvp Css framework. So I'll put the I'll put this on the chat right now, and then I'll share it again in the classroom. But what's super cool about this thing is it's designed to be a good look and feel for any web page with no effort. And what they have here is like a sample HTML page, which you could kind of edit in a text editor. Oops, let me just change the sharing so you can see this. Hold on a sec. Okay. Right. So can you see this now? It's like this is a text editor.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So this is, by the way, it's a Visual Studio Code. It's a free text editor from Microsoft. Oops, that was, is that what I wanted to do? Yeah, you can still see. A free text editor, you can get it from, just search for Visual Studio Code. The code is important because there's another Visual Studio, which is a very expensive software development tool. But this one is free. And it's a very nice text editor for editing files. Anyway, this is the HTML file that we've just downloaded from which accompanies the Mvp Css framework. And what this is just kind of a muster, like a sample, where they show a complete page with all the kind of elements of what you could do with this CSS framework. So it's a nice starting point, shows you, for example, how to include an image here, how to do lists, super simple. And for anyone who already knows some HTML, this is, as you can see, it's basically just HTML. There's nothing too complicated in here. Okay. Now, if I go back to mvp.css, then you have the framework, the CSS framework itself. Now, this thing, I'm just going to look at it briefly in the browser. This thing you actually don't need to download. All you need to do is include that somewhere at the top of your HTML, which is what's being done in the example here. But here they recommend loading it from this web server called unpackage.com, and Unpackage is a public, free-to-use content delivery system for CSS and JavaScript. So a lot of different libraries get put on here. And if I just copy that link, you'll see there's a file on here. This is the CSS for mvp.css. So, and in here, what they're doing is they're defining how different things should look. Like, for example, up here, they're setting what are called CSS variables, and it explains on the web page you could override these. But here it's doing some things like setting the color of the background of the page to white. It's setting the text color to black. It's setting the width of the page, for example, and doing various, and setting the fonts that could be used on this page. Okay? And all you need to do is include that in your web page, and magically your page will start to look good. In fact, I could demonstrate that to you right now. Okay, so this is the page with MVP CSS included. It's not the greatest design in the world, I admit, but it looks okay. Would you agree? It's kind of acceptable as a web page. Now, if I just quickly temporarily remove this line where we're, sorry, if I just remove that, so I'll remove the line that includes mvp.css, deploy a new version of the web app. By the way, for those, if you missed the lesson 5, that's where we introduced how web apps work. So you may want to go back and look at lesson 5, but basically you can deploy web apps here. They get a custom URL. Now, if I go and look at this, this is how the page looks without MVP CSS applied. So it's using Times New Roman. It looks pretty ugly. That's compared to this version, which has MVP CSS included. So what logically what CSS does, if you have some HTML, you can apply CSS on top to style it. That's why it's called cascading style sheets. So if you think of HTML, it's like a car without any paint or upholstery or kind of fancy chrome work, and the CSS adds all the kind of trimmings and the paint of the car and this kind of stuff. So the car itself, the HTML, is not fundamentally changed. It's just the CSS gives it a look and feel. Okay, right. So let's go back into looking at this thing. So next thing I want to just quickly introduce is this idea of HTML templates. Okay, now we looked at this briefly in lesson 5, but with Google Apps Script, you have what's called a kind of a template language or a template syntax. So what's the point of templates? If you haven't run into this before, the concept of templating, you may have seen this in, like, if you've ever used a mail merge program. So you design your email and then you have some placeholders for like the person you're sending an email to. Basically, that's what templates are. And the idea is that you want to separate the HTML as much as possible. You separate the HTML that displays the page from the code that sits behind it, because that makes it easier to manage the project. If we pack this all into one file, it would very quickly end up being a mess that's very hard to read and work with when you want to make changes later. So that's why we kind of tend to use HTML, use templates, sorry. Now, with Google Apps Script, there are actually kind of 3 types of template syntax. In fact, let me just put in an additional one from the code to make it clear. So you have this. I'll just highlight that in orange. All right, so let's start with the simplest one, so the green one here. When you have a less than question mark equals, what that allows you to do is just immediately output the value of a variable. So attendees I is the name of an attendee. And on this page, that's what you're seeing on here. You're seeing people's names, which are stored in the spreadsheet. Okay. Let's go back to, so what we're doing here with this syntax in a template, you can simply output the value of a variable. If you use less than with a question mark but no equal sign, then what you can do is embed JavaScript directly into the HTML. And this you do for basically being able to loop over this list of attendees and then output the values here. So what this bit is doing, in case you're wondering, is it displays an unordered list. That means a list where it's just with bullets with no numbers. UL says unordered list, and LI stands for list item. So these bits are the HTML. This is JavaScript. And to make this work, because you have like an opening parenthesis for this loop, we also have to put the closing parenthesis here. Okay, so that's the second way you can use this template syntax. And the third way is with this exclamation mark. And what that says is include and execute this, or insert and execute some third-party content. So here, in fact, we're adding the CSS style sheet to the page. Okay? Are you all following me so far?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Yep.
Now, the thing I should say, okay, so let's just quickly have a quick glance scan over this index.html file. So here what you can see is we're including the style sheet file here. This contains a little bit of CSS. Up here, it's all just like plain HTML. And then down here, this is where we have this loop of attendees where we create the list. Okay? And the rest is all just basically plain HTML. Okay, so how do we actually go and use this? And where does this include function come from? Okay, so let's take a look. You may remember from lesson 5, any time you create a web app from here, to be able to respond to requests for the page, you need to implement this special method doGet. And doGet should return the contents of the web page. Then what we do inside here is we use the HTML service that Google provides, and we create a template from a file, and the file is index. We can skip the HTML, we just say index. We don't need to put the file extension on the end. Okay, and so we create a template from the file, that's this variable. Then what we do is we can just create whatever variable name we want and attach it to the template object. So we can say template.attendees, that's where I want to put the data for the attendees, which is going to come from this function here. And this function here basically, I'm not going to go through it because you've seen this type of code many times, but it basically just goes through here and pulls out everyone who said that they are coming to the apéro. Okay. All right, so what we're doing there is basically populating this variable attendees with some data from the spreadsheet. Then we return with template.evaluate. And evaluate means kind of figure out what needs to happen with the template. And so if I go back here, you'll see, you'll see that there is our attendees variable. So it exists without, just like that in the scope within the template. For the programmers that might be confused, you can just use that variable immediately. So as we've attached it here, you can then just go ahead and use it. And so we're looping over the data from the spreadsheet. We're looping over these names in effect. Okay. And then let's have a look at this include. So include, from the template, you can call functions directly within your code. So, and we can call this function include. And what include does is allows us to embed other files. So here we're saying create some HTML from another file and get the contents to inject into our index. So in fact, up here, when we say include style sheet, we're pulling in this and embedding it into our HTML page. And then at the bottom, we say include JavaScript. That's we're pulling in this JavaScript here. And there is some client-side JavaScript. So this is JavaScript that's going to run in your web browser, not on your web server. So far, so good. Any questions at this point, or just to clarify anything that you are unclear about? Okay, good.
Yes.
Deep silence. But let me just quote South Park. Just remember, there are no stupid questions, only stupid people. So now's your chance to ask the stupidest questions. No? Okay, good. But feel free to interrupt at any time. All right. So this include, in other words, this include function doesn't come by default as part of Google Apps Script. You have to recreate it every time to be able to include different files. Now, one thing here is you might be wondering, if you're a programmer, why is the JavaScript put in a file called .html? Well, this is just something about the Google Apps Script platform. So normally you'd go ahead and create a script file for server-side JavaScript. The HTML files means anything HTML, CSS, and client-side JavaScript. So you create them like that. And basically for a simple app, this pattern seems to be fairly common. So you have your main code.gs, that's your main Google Apps Script. Then you'd have like index.html is the main HTML page. Then you put your CSS in stylesheet.html and your client-side JavaScript in javascript.html. And then a couple of points about how you include these. So when you add a style sheet, you want to put it in the head section of the HTML, and maybe right before the title isn't a bad place to do it, as we're doing here. But the JavaScript in general, it's best practice to put this right at the end of a page, just before the closing body tag. That should be body there, actually. I'll just illustrate that way. And so right before the closing body tag, that's where you put your JavaScript. And the reason for that is it's basically I'm not going to go in super depth in this, but basically there is an order by which a web browser processes a web page. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to load all the HTML. Now, if we go back to this page, so this thing, for example, is a CSS file that's on a third-party web server. So what your browser does is it first reads through all the HTML of the page after it's been processed as a template, of course. Then it goes and looks for things that are links to third-party content. And in fact, on all the browsers, you could even see when a page first loaded, you could see how it looked before, for like maybe half a second before the style sheet fully loaded. You could see the page in this unstyled form like this. So with Times New Roman and stuff like that. So basically what happens is the browser loads all the HTML, then it's going to go and load the CSS and then the JavaScript. And you could put the JavaScript at the top, but in the way a web browser executes a page, there are some reasons in the order that browsers do things that basically, to be safe, you always want to include JavaScript at the bottom of the page so that the browser's finish setting up the page properly before you start running any JavaScript on the client side. Okay, so long story short, just put the include JavaScript right at the end. Okay. Yeah, so we're just wandering through this still. All right, let me just jump back to mvp.css for a second. So this thing basically gives you a great starting point for doing stuff. You can include CSS and so on. What you can also do, if you have a look at the documentation, so it explains all the HTML tags that it styles. So if you use things that are on this list, then they're going to come out looking nice with mvp.css. You also can have, with this thing, these are CSS variables, we can also change some of the defaults. So these are all the default settings. What I could do, if I go into style sheet, is just copy this thing and let's make a couple of minor changes, or possibly huge changes depending on your perspective. So I can just select a couple of these variables and decide to change them. So let's change this to black, and so the background color becomes black and the text color becomes white. Okay, now let's reload the page. There you go. So now it's looking a lot more stylish. It's very, if you wanted to do it that way. Good. So now let's go now a little bit into the whole form processing, and then I'll show you another trick with images, how you can store images on Google Drive. All right, so here is the form that corresponds to this form down here for the RSVP, okay? And this is the HTML that generates that. Now, I'm not going to go into if you can go and check out an HTML reference for each of these tags and what its attributes are and what they all mean. But basically, you can see, for example, input type. We've got a label here, so we're labeling. Oops, that's actually should be name. And that should be the label for email. So a label is this part. So when you have a form field, like where you can put your name on, then you attach a label to it in that manner. And then here we have the button to submit the form, which is this button here. Okay, so let me give you a quick demo of what will happen. So I type in my name. Say, yes, I'm coming, and I need a gluten-free diet. And I hit submit, little think, and then it displays this message down here. Okay, and now if we look in the spreadsheet, there you can see the values that I entered. Okay. So what actually happened behind the scenes? So the first thing is, up here, when you have the form, you can say on submit, and that means when the form is submitted, run this piece of client-side JavaScript. Okay, handle form submit, and then you say this, which means run handle form submit with the contents of this form. Okay. Then if we go and look in here, here is our handle form submit with the form data that we passed. And then what we're doing here is calling this thing, this function that Google provides called Google Script Run with the data from the form. Now what Google Script Run does is it allows you with client-side JavaScript to call a function on the server side, which is this function process form. And process form lives right here in the code that I've written. So what happens is we call that method with the contents of the form, we call process form. If I go into process form, what you can see is when we call it, you get the form. So now we go and open the spreadsheet, and then we create a row out of values in the form, form.name, form.email, etc. And then we append a row to the spreadsheet, and whatever we return will be sent back to the client-side JavaScript. So and what happens is you say Google App Script run with success handler. So what that means is if the form submission is successful, it should call this function, update URL. Actually, let's rename that because I copied and pasted some code here. Let's call it display success, for example. Okay, so we call this function process form, and then if it's successful, we call that function on the client side. And what that function does is it populates the output that we see here. Now this may be getting a bit heavy, but the good news is basically this example application, it's pretty simple, and I think it will probably give you a good starting point. Like once you've seen this once, you can reuse this principle pretty much you could use it. It will apply to any smallish application. Okay. Right. So we've submitted the form. It's got put into the spreadsheet, and then when we reload the page, at the moment it says who's coming, John Mary. Let's reload that. Fantastic. There, I'm now on the list of names for who's coming. Okay. Now, what was a couple of interesting points? So why do we need to use this Google Apps Script run? Again, if you've done any web development before, you might be confused. Why can't I just use a normal HTTP post? Well, all code that runs on Google Apps Script gets passed through this thing called Google Cadger. And Google Cadger is a way, a tool for making third-party, yeah, you can see, third-party JavaScript safe. It gets used, for example, on websites where ads are being displayed that come from third-party websites. So Google passes them through Cadger so that no one can be inserting dodgy scripts into another company's website. Okay, but also all things on Google Apps Script are protected with this thing. So that is why you can't make a normal form post. Instead, you have to use Google Apps Script run. And there's a page here that explaining how that works. So this class Google Script run exists on the client side, and it allows you to call server-side functions. Okay, let's check here. Yeah, there we go. All right, sorry, I'm just jumping between too many things. Okay, so there we've got the form, we've seen the CSS. Now, let's just look a little bit more in here. This, again, because we don't make normal HTTP posts, we actually have to disable the default behavior of all forms on the page to prevent them submitting the way a browser normally does. So this chunk of code here, on any page that you're using that contains a form, you probably want to put that. And instead you have this handle form submit, and that thing is the function where that was declared in this onSubmit attribute. Okay, and then finally, sorry, just got some dry throat. So finally, what happens is we call the Google with success handler, and the success handler is called display success. And what it does is it gets this element from the page called output and inserts whatever response it got from the server into that. So as we already said, that's the message that appears under here when you fill in the form. Any questions about how the form handling works? Or so far, so good?
I think there was a question from Omar.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see it. Isn't onSubmit already overriding the default event on the form? Probably it is. Yeah, it's a good question. I would actually, I would agree with you that I would assume it is, but maybe there is some situation where it doesn't. And basically, I've linked to this in the slides, but this is Google's example of how to do, how to call this Google Apps Script. So how to submit forms. And this code comes from Google. So I'm assuming that they had some reason, like maybe there's some web browser that if you don't explicitly disable form submission, it's going to go ahead and do it. So yeah, so I would say probably best to play safe and add it anyway, because there may be some device or browser that does things in a strange way. Okay, Omar? All right, cool. So another thing I just want to show you is a trick for embedding images from Google Drive. So you'll find the images in the classroom folder. And if you're using a browser like Chrome, so here's our Appro Inviter, there's the spreadsheet slides for today and the images. And I uploaded these images. You may find there are a bunch of these types of services online, but you may find using a service like this, if you upload images, just make sure that anything, if you upload an image, if it's above about, let's say, 250 kilobytes, it's getting large. This one is probably a bit too large, like it's 783 kilobytes. The reason why that matters is because otherwise, when you load the page, this image is going to take a long time to load. So you can see here, it took a bit to if I reload the page again, took a little bit of time to load that image. And the smaller you make the image, the quicker it loads. And fast web pages are good at making users happy. All right, so we're including this image up here. Now, how did we do that? So first I uploaded the image, and then technically it's kind of, Google isn't exactly encouraging people to serve images as web pages from Google Drive. But here's how you can actually do it. So if you double click on the image, and then with a browser like Chrome, you say developer inspect elements. And then what you do is just click on the image, and you'll see that's the HTML for the image. And then I can just double click on the link, and that's the URL to the image. So that's the image that's on Google Drive. Once I've got that, then I'm able to directly embed it in a web page using a standard HTML image tag. So that's the trick for those images. Okay, now what I thought, as we've got a little bit of time left, that might be fun to just try and risk extending this code to add calendar invites automatically to people. So if I go into Google Calendar, let's get rid of some of these additional calendars, and I create, oh, actually no, what we're going to do is we're going to use the TX Academy calendar for the sake of this exercise. So we could say, I can put an Appro event in here. Okay, so just create an event. Now, I have a few handy tricks ready for this situation for TX Academy. So I have this web page where I can see all the events in the TX Academy calendar. So let me just quickly recap what I'm doing here. I've got a shared calendar. This is not my own calendar, but it's a TX Academy calendar. And that has some advantages that you can set up your own sharing, etc., who's got access to edit things in the calendar. And then I've on this web page, you can see there's the Appro event I created, and I need to use the iCal ID, and this you can only get using code. I'll show you that in a second. So that's the event, the calendar event. So we could add a function like send invite, for example. And I'm just gonna put in a comment there with the ID of the event. Okay. Now, if I'll just head over to script, to the Google script, and close that one, and get look in the code for, because I can't remember off the top of my head how to do this. Look how I did it for TX Academy to send calendar invites. So in the main TX Academy code, we have the onRegistered and we have the send invite method. And that's down here. So, right. So here's what we do. Yeah. So I'll copy that code over and then explain it in a second. Now I need two things. I need a calendar ID. Where do I get that from? So when you look in Google Calendar for any calendar that you have, if you click on the settings, you'll see further down somewhere, there we go, calendar ID. So I copy that, that's the calendar ID for this TX Academy calendar. So I'll just paste that in here. And then I don't need to do this in a loop. All I need to do now is I get an instance of the event I created in the calendar using this ID. Okay. And then we've got that, and then I can say, okay, send invite, we'll just put email here. And I can say event, add guest, and we'll use that email. So that's how we send a calendar, like the super cut down way to send a calendar invite. So this, now I'll just show you very briefly, how did I work out what this event was? In here is where I do this stuff. And basically when you query Google Calendar, when you get a list of events, the events have this method get ID, and that's how you get this cal ID. So let's just see. Do something like this. Yeah, so here's how I do that. This is getting all the events 1 year into the future. So I'll put this example in the code here so that you could copy this. Okay. So you can get the iCal ID from event.getID. Okay. So that's just an example for how you would end up getting this value here. All right, so we've got a method now, a function, sorry, to send invites to people. Here's where we process the form. So let's just finish off by doing a send invite to form.email. Okay, publish as a new web app. Okay, so we've got to now have a change in permissions because I'm using the calendar. So it says things about calendar there. I'm going to allow that. Okay, now I'm going to live dangerously and risk the demo effect and give you guys the link. If you click on that link, that's the Apro page. Apro page there. And fill this in. Let's see if you get an invite to the event. You can do this yourselves as well. Hit submit. That worked. You guys filling in the form?
Yes.
Okay.
Done.
And if I reload this, if all goes well, there you go. And you declined, Frank. Oh my God.
I think this is on June the 3rd, and I'm in my calendar. I'm out of office, so it automatically declines.
Yeah. So we automated, and it automated back. Fantastic.
Yeah. But at least it didn't create a ping pong.
But as you can see, it's like a very easy way to have like a fully integrated process. So you fill in the form, it gets added, the data gets put in the spreadsheet, and then, wow, you guys have been filling this in a lot. And then you end up with a calendar invite, like super nicely integrated, the whole thing. So, you know, and if people get a calendar invite, there's a good chance they might actually attend something. Yeah, did that all make sense?
Yeah, of course I need to work on some other lessons first, but yeah, it made sense.
Great. So, I think with 3 minutes left to go, I think we stop the course here. May return to it, and you're always welcome if you're getting into stuff. Actually, I'll share also the playlist, which is so you can go back and watch any old videos. You're always welcome to come and ask me. I'm very. I mean, for me, the thing is like I think it's such a useful platform for doing automation, and you know, also having done this course, for me, it just makes me super happy if you guys actually use this stuff. So there's a playlist for you, Jazin, and if you want to go back over old lessons. And if you guys, the best thing I can suggest to all of you is just give it a try. Like see how far you can get with automating things. If you find your first project, just give it a try and see, just like dive in, see how far you get. And if you have questions, you're welcome to come to me, and we will. So far, I think we've had Michael here's been doing things. Adela, I know you have too. Martina, we actually built her solution last time. Martina, have you deployed it yet, though? Are you doing it now?
Not yet, but I'm planning to.
Okay, excellent. I hear the planning too. And Omar's created a beer logistics system for his flat with his inhabitants. So that's some success stories, I think. Does anyone have any more success stories I haven't heard about? Another project you've been doing with this? So far, no. Well, like I say, if you do need support and help, I'm happy to help out. And yeah, then I would say this lesson is finished. I wish you
Thank
guys.
you.
Yeah, pleasure. I'll stop the recording now so you can all come back.